So the context for this conversation is that I remember you mentioning some time ago that pedagogy was one of your fundamental interests, and that you had spent a decent chunk of time, what most people would call quite a bit of time, looking into it. My own attempts to look at the pedagogical literature have yielded mixed results. Like, they do give a variety of interesting and useful techniques, and there are some things that a lot of people seem to agree on. But like you would say in your factor analysis model, right, it's hard to pin down, okay, these are things that have big effects versus this might be kind of a nice incremental thing to add on. So it's not very easy to figure that out. And another thing is that the field seems absolutely riven with fads. For most of the search terms that I've tried to use, like most of the literature seems to be on, so-and-so school system. Yeah, that's the context. Since you have mentioned that you do in fact have a reasonably compressed list of what you think the highest or most impactful techniques are that really seem to work, would you mind telling me what they are? Just a list so that then we can dig into each one.
Yeah, so a little bit of context on the list. Yeah, I had the same problem. I found that there was this research review. They wanted to know what are the largest effect sizes and did they replicate, right? And so their conclusion, they seem to be pretty competent compared to others. And this is often the case I find when I'm investigating a field. It's a matter of figuring out where are the competent people, and they're not hiding exactly, but it takes some time to track them down. They do often write research reviews, so that's helpful. Anyway,
so you did this triangulation.
Yeah. So this particular research review, they found, so the cutoff is somewhat arbitrary, right? You expect there's probably a long tail of results that are, semi-reliable. But in their opinion, there were 4 interventions that sort of made the cutoff in terms of we should feel very confident that these 4 interventions are doing something real.
Okay.
And it was kind of surprising in the sense that this is not standard. Like, this is not just widely known. This is not practice. It doesn't seem to be implemented in the...
How old was the review?
Not super old. I believe 2000s.
So still more than, around 10 years old at this point.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'll have to dig up the citation. But
okay. A decade is long enough for things to have worked their way into various systems.
Not in education.
Assuming that there is at least somebody who has a significant interest and ability to move things.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, so just briefly...
So it's an opportunity in a way for somebody who wants to jump into this.
Yeah, I think that's true. Pedagogy research does not exactly, attract people with very ambitious career paths. Most of those people get drawn into math and physics these days. But anyway, so let's see, if I can remember off the top of my head before. Deliberate practice, elaboration of context, test taking, which I think winds up subsuming something of effective studying strategies.
Okay.
And the last one is teaching the material to others.
Okay.
So we can probably just go through those in turn and give a bit of elaboration for what they are, at least definitely. in sort of the way they were studied, and then also there's the way that they were studied, and then also sort of the folk model that we might have of why do we think this is working? Why does this seem reasonable?
Okay. And regarding the paper, did you think their cutoff was a good one? Would you have used the same cutoff, or would you have included a few more or even fewer interventions than they did?
I think it's pretty reasonable. There might have been some motivation in the sense of wanting to give a nice, neat answer. But just looking at effect sizes, it did seem there is such a thing as large, medium, and small effect sizes.
So there was a cleavage point.
There was kind of a natural drop off. When you have a power law distribution, there's sort of at the knee of the curve, and you're just yep, we've captured 80% of the variance with this 20%. So let's call it a day.
So is it in this case? Is it that big of a effect?
It's pretty similar.
Okay, yeah. So you will, if someone, let's say, according to these people, for the vast majority of people, these methods that you have talked about will capture the vast.
That's my sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So
yeah, let's go over these one by one.
Yeah, deliberate practice is the one that I'm least confident in summarizing, just because I haven't boned up on the sort of underlying deliberate practice literature lately. Mm-hmm. But the central idea is obviously just chunking and practice of skills in practice of the micro skills that build up into the macro skill. So it's a sort of a two birds with one stone situation, because you're always also learning the meta skill of trying to figure out like which chunks make sense in addition to actually practicing the chunks, right? So at least if you are sort of doing this actively and not just passively, taking someone else's word for it, if you are the one trying to make the chunks, then you're also doing a thing to your representation of the knowledge in the domain, right? So you're permuting the content of the domain, but you're also doing a thing where you are learning the structure of the data in the domain. Which chunks make sense, and what's the flow between them is being tacitly learned by you doing the chunking.
So you're not only adapting yourself to the domain, you're also adapting some particular cleavage of the domain to yourself or to your way of thinking.
Yeah, and so this is commensurate with the literature on expertise, right? That experts are people who they've done this process and they have a representation that directs their attention to the actual causal levers in the domain, right? They don't have pretend steering wheels, they have real steering wheels. Okay,
so they have their hands on the real affordances.
Yeah, like what are the high leverage points, so to speak.
Okay.
So that's a discovery process that I don't think you can necessarily short circuit just by having someone tell you that those are the leverage points. If you don't have any, if that doesn't correspond to some direct experiential knowledge of your own of playing with it, right? This is why most good teaching contexts give you a lot of toy problems to play with, and good toy problems, even though they're toy problems, have the same cut points as the real problems.
As the real domain. Okay.
Yeah.
So then. Right, so this is one of the insights behind, well, maybe not Moore method, but certainly, potentially Moore method also, but also the idea of problem-based learning, where you give somebody the material to solve a problem in the quote-unquote correct way, only after they have wrestled with why that would, with the problem on its own for some time.
Yeah. And also then sort of word problems. So you give them a problem in the, famously word problems, right? That students have trouble with. Well, it's giving you the problem in a slightly different format and asking you to do the mental operations to convert it to the problem-solving format, right? So because that's the valuable thing in terms of being able to then take it out and do in the world. But that's also involved in elaboration of context, so that intersects with that one too. What else about deliberate practice?
Doesn't this require the field to be relatively well specified though?
You want, when you're practicing the skill of deliberate practice itself, you're practicing the meta skill by doing it, you want your first few instances to be in well-defined fields so that you have the answer book and you sort of know if you're on the right track or not.
Okay, and where enough people have done the chunking in the past that you in fact do have genuinely good quality chunks in a sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You ideally are in the situation where you're accidentally rederiving results that they are, and that's a good indicator that you've internalized the correct generators.
Okay. Now this does in fact fix a big problem that I had, which was the fact that, in certain domains like chess, right, where deliberate practice has outsized effects or violin or whatnot, these are in some sense extremely well characterized domains.
Yes.
Where the skill trees have been broken down into just specific chunks. Even if many of the chunks may not be legible, the actual experts know them.
Right.
And so, so they will do it on that basis. And so you say that even the meta skill is potentially learnable?
Yes, I think that there's a reason that people, as they achieve mastery, they start saying very similar sounding things, because the structure of learning itself winds up being a thing, and it just becomes easier and easier. So like running cycles, you can run cycles in this intentionally, right? And with arbitrary things. So I did it for literally speed Tetris at one point, just because I had a few weeks where I wasn't doing anything, and I was like, oh yeah, I haven't played Tetris in 10 years. I wonder if I could use this as a toy problem. And so I did it while observing myself learning. And explicitly doing the chunking and thinking about it, and then checking that understanding against. So I'd come up with my own model, and then I would go and check that against what experts at Tetris say. They have their own tutorials and stuff about, this world record, we interviewed this world record Tetris, blah, blah, blah. It's like a well-defined enough thing that there's some material, not a lot, because it's not like a huge world of Tetris champions, but there's a little bit, right? And so you can sort of check your understanding. And that actually brings me to a good point of to mention, I think most people don't take advantage of all of the calibration available. So calibration means you're neither overconfident or underconfident about your own confidence about something. Being able to say, yeah, I believe this, but I'm only 70% confident in it.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are very well calibrated at that, and it usually is a result of practice.
Okay.
And so one of the things you can do is you can like play explicit calibration games that people have come up with, right?
Mm-hmm.
But actually, you don't need someone to have scaffolded this for you. You always have the opportunity to get calibration data. Every time you're about to run a Google search on something that has like a pretty well-defined answer,
mm-hmm.
you have the opportunity to guess first.
Okay.
And then check, and if you're right, great. If you're wrong, you can introspect on what was the generator of your answer and what seems to be different about the generator of the answer that you're actually getting.
Okay.
This isn't fail proof because you
Many
can
domains
get
are not that well.
yeah, and you can also get wrong answers sometimes, especially if your Google foo is bad and you're doing confirmation bias on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Which is another good point. Yeah, you usually need to search the inverse of search terms as well as the proper version of the search term
calibrated,
to be sure that you're not just fooling yourself. This also replicated. It was found that people with access to Google were doing no better than coin flips on average if they didn't know about this sort of thing. If they didn't know to search negative search terms as well. Anyway, so I think that covers most of deliberate practice. Does it strike you that there's other pieces?
Just one question, how much of deliberate practice is a name for deliberately running both object level and a meta feedback loop? And then focusing on the margin of, oh yeah, this is where I am doing badly, so just push on that repeatedly.
Certainly you can have someone else run the meta loop for you, and I think a lot of people do. But yeah, ultimately you want to internalize it for yourself. Okay. Yeah.
And would you say that the difference between someone who is potentially wanting to found a new field, right? Mm-hmm. Not out of vanity, just because there is perhaps a real cleavage of understanding there, versus someone who is trying to just get better at a given field or a given set of characterized fields. The meta loop is more important for the first person than the second?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, if you want to be at the top of even an established field, you will, PhD is philosophy doctorate, right? You've really engaged with the deep structure of that field, and you understand why some of the choices were made to represent the field in that way, and you see other ways that it could be. Is really the definition of being sort of competent, or the sharp end of the field, in my opinion.
Right, like that's where the philosophy comes in. You have transcended the boundaries of
merely what's been done. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the deliberate practice is applicable just beyond learning well-characterized fields. Mm-hmm. And it's got a broader scope. Okay. All right. Thanks. That's a nice pithy summary.
Yeah. So then, elaboration of context. The other ones should be similar, or should be simpler. So elaboration of context means mostly just that you are getting the opportunity to try to apply this to many disparate things, and in the process of doing that, connecting it up with the rest of your knowledge graph. That it's not just isolated, and these many connections create more opportunities. It's sort of like a self-building virtuous cycle of more connections creates the possibility for even more connections, right? As it becomes integrated with other knowledge, as well as helping with memory. But basically, you have more on-ramps to being able to notice that a particular set of tools that you have is applicable to a particular situation.
Right.
If it's connected more.
Right. So it's the difference between, let's say, a very simple example, somebody who notices that they should apply what little they know of mathematics to what they see in the supermarket, versus someone who just doesn't.
Right.
Yeah, this is a very primitive example, but
yeah, and so we talked very briefly before about the idea of the Oxford tutorial mm-hmm. being, among other things, probably aimed at this. And if our thesis is true that this learning comes mostly from these four things, then this would be actually the primary benefit of the Oxford tutorial style, where just sort of hashing the subject out between yourselves is causing you to, so you already have the ways it's connected for you, and then hearing the ways that it's connected for other people mm-hmm. helps enrichen your your graph, your knowledge graph as well. And this is my impression. I don't know how to summarize this very well, but my impression is that this is one of the major benefits of concentration of talent at the elite universities, is that it's not just that they, get access to like the best professors. It's that when they're around excellent peers, that there's a transfer of interesting heuristics that occurs, and that the synergistic effect can be much more than the sum of its parts. Someone with 10 powerful tools can be much more than 10 times more powerful than someone with one tool. They might be 100 or 1,000 times more powerful, just because there's really good synergy between some of them.
Because in some sense, there's that old thing, right? Like, you would rather have 100 different functions operating on one data structure than you would 10 functions operating on 10 different data structures. In some sense, like, even if your ontology doesn't fully match, the fact that the toolkits can be imported from one another, even if they are not native to you, like, okay, fine. I hate Bob's approach, but I will concede grudgingly that it is perhaps the most economical in this case, or something like that. Okay. Is there anything else you think there's about
for elaboration
of context? Yeah.
Implementation details. I mean, I think everyone's experienced this in terms of it's easier than ever, because now we can go on deep Wikipedia dives where we have you're 20 links deep, and you're sort of connecting up lots of different ideas. So I think people are doing this more than ever already on their own.
So then, does that mean that in such a case, mode switching, as in both focus study as well as the kind of diffuse background thinking that happens when there's something going on in the back of your head when you go take a run, or
and that's why it's really valuable. I don't like, one of the things I don't like about the way current education operates is that they keep having you switch between different topics, when actually it's more like you should have one central project, and you relate it to a bunch of other stuff that you might be doing, but you're sort of, in the real world, in R&D, you often have researchers just really focused, and they keep circling the main area of idea for, weeks at a time. And that's where those, shower thoughts and eureka moments come from, I think. It's just kind of bouncing around. You go for a walk, it's bouncing around. It's still happening in the background. There's a lot of, concentration and focus.
Yeah, I mean, this is both me and a friend of mine. We've shared experiences about how at a certain point when you're dealing with the edge of your capacity in mathematics, right? Problem solving is more like a form of praying, one might say, where you try very hard at the problem, and unlike Feynman, you don't immediately write down the answer. You just relax a bit and trust that it will come. And oddly enough, that seems to be an important component. And if it's within your grasp that problem is, for whatever reason, it is actually something which is at your edge and you can get it, then yes, it does generally come. So
if I was teaching people, it would be, we're going to spend 2 to 3 months mostly focused on this one thing.
Right.
Rather than you're going to focus on 4 things. So let's see, I think that covers elaboration of context.
Right.
The next one is test taking, and with it study. And again, here the idea, I think, is fairly simple. It's just that having a real, a non-fake deadline, at which point you will be tested on the material, is a forcing function, right? In a way that just more casual engagement with the material isn't necessarily serving the same purpose. And they didn't get into this in the paper. My personal supposition is that test taking, at least in the good case, will somewhat encourage students, although some of them might have bad study habits. I think usually it probably encourages students to do something like progressive summarization of their notes.
Okay.
Right, to go back and compress it down to something that they can actually remember. And this action of compression seems to me to be vital to generating this understanding.
Okay, so this is regarding what kind of fields exactly? Because I want to give a historical counterpoint, which is in my own school and large parts of undergrad education, right? This never happened. This might be because there were a bunch of other extremely bad issues with the whole thing. But like I don't know.
Yeah, I might have a warped perspective because most of my schooling involved tests that were like, you can bring one note card.
Okay. Yeah, we could never do that.
Okay.
A lot of it was...
But I feel like that's just a different choice where expecting memorization is still the same thing in the sense of, well, yeah, but you have a limited amount of time to do the memorization, and there's only a certain amount of sort of material that you would even in theory be able to memorize even if you had unlimited time. You also have open book tests, in which case I believe that the teacher's usually expecting you to have formed a good enough index over the material that you can figure out quickly what to look for, because an open book test is usually harder.
Yes.
Which means that there's going to be more time. Most people are experiencing more time pressure, and so this is another form of constraint, and it's still just forcing you to learn structure. Right. This is the structure of the knowledge.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's all just choices of forcing the student to develop some sort of efficient representation.
Okay. So you think that when, like in the right context and use the right way, as opposed to the kind of total bullshit that I had to put up with, testing is in fact a very effective strategy.
Yeah, this replicated
Okay.
well.
All right. Good to know. And the last one? Wait, is there anything else in...
Yeah, just one comment. So, I mean, you can imagine that, yes, tests can be pathological, but it still might be more of a constraint than all of the pathology that can occur with no tests.
Oh,
right?
well, of course.
Maybe it can just go off the rails into sort of la-la land. And I think that some theories of education have sort of gone off into la-la land.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can agree with that. What's your view on high-stakes testing?
I don't know. I think they might have commented on that, if I remember correctly. It was more frequent lower stakes testing performed better, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. I'll have to double check.
That's been my own anecdotal experience, by the way.
Yeah.
Like I found it was, so one of my classes involved a structure where there were regular tests every few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, you were allowed to drop the lowest or something.
Right.
And so if you had a very nice record throughout, you could just straight up drop the finals. Like, yeah, screw you, I don't need it. And one of the, one might say...
It's highly motivating.
It's very motivating, yes. Two, no individual thing is ever extremely high stakes.
Right.
And three, there's constant feedback and calibration.
Yeah, it's much more data for the student and for the teacher. The teacher needs to do some tailoring themselves, right? So if everyone fails or does poorly on a test, that's super important data for them to be able to tailor things. Yeah, so that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay. So calibration and feedback both for student and teacher. And if I'm learning on my own, which is I think what a lot of people interested in this conversation might be doing.
I think stuff like considerations like this are why it's difficult for people to learn on their own.
As in, it's difficult for them to come up with a equally effective forcing function.
It's hard to develop your own feedback metrics and stick to them compared to having someone set that up for you.
Right.
Especially when you're not confident that the ones you're setting up are good.
When you're not already conversant enough with the field to know.
Yeah.
Okay. So here is an area where some kind of peer or even somebody like a peer who's a bit ahead can be potentially very helpful.
Right.
Where they can say, don't worry too much about this bit because everyone bangs their head.
Oh, and that can save you hours of
exactly.
wild goose chases. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Right, the 80-20 problem where some trivial skill can take up 80% of your time if you're not careful. Okay. Thank you. And the fourth?
What's the fourth? The fourth is teaching the material.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this has overlap. I think that teaching the material forces compression.
Okay.
So lecturers, have to condense things down to bullet points.
Mm-hmm.
And
attention spans.
Yeah. And lecturers report that after their first few semesters of teaching something, it's a pretty consistent report that it deepens their understanding of it a lot too. And my impression of why that is, having taught some small things, not like in a weekly lecture type way,
May I ask
but just
if you want to share.
like physical exercise and emotional coping skills and meditation, things like that. You get to observe a surprisingly broad array of ways that students get it wrong. And oftentimes these will be so out of left field that they sort of like poke your knowledge. You're like, oh, I just never thought of that. I don't know. I don't instantly have an answer for how to deal with that. I have to actually think about it. I have to query the model and figure out,
Right, you
okay,
have to query
how do you deal with that?
Like what could have gone wrong with the student's model?
Yes. So So it again involves tuning the meta model. So I have to step into their ontology, diff it with my ontology, and figure out the mapping function between them. And so this is just quality time spent debugging your own ontology and noticing because when you do that, you usually identify that you had some confusions that you didn't notice were there too.
Right. As in, if it turns out that you ran with an implicit assumption that, say, a textbook and teacher made, and the student didn't, and it turns out that it was potentially important because that has load-bearing consequences, but nobody ever bothered to say it out loud.
Yep.
Now you just explicated something that really matters.
Yep.
Or if you're either very lucky or unlucky, figured out that there is a constraint to what you're teaching, which you had not thought about before. Okay.
So those were the 4 from the paper. Anything else about teaching? Let's see off the top of my head. I think this is pointing to the idea that for a lot of people, being forced to teach the material is the forcing function on explicit engagement with the metastructure of the knowledge. So when doing deliberate practice, a lot of it might have still remained tacit. Like, yeah, they're poking around here and there and trying skills, but it might have still been pretty fluid. Whereas this forces, no, I have to like turn it into words and tell it to someone else. So I have to explicitly engage with the structure.
So in some sense, this would be like everything else you might get away with unit testing. Teaching is the only thing that forces you to do integration style testing, like end-to-end system testing.
Yeah. If your students are able to pass the test or not.
Even before you begin teaching, if you're a responsible teacher, that is. It forces you to sort of do a integration test of your own understanding when you're creating the curriculum or setting it out. Okay. All right.
So that's those 4. There was also another meta principle that came in when we were discussing. There's also not just the structure of the knowledge, but observing people applying that. So in the forecasting literature, one of the largest effect sizes is judgmental bootstrapping. And the idea there is that if you go to experts and you ask them how they do something and they explain the model and you try to like code up that model into some sort of formal decision process and follow the decision process, it's often pretty bad. It doesn't actually work.
Yeah.
However, if you ask them to solve toy problems in front of you, you write down what they do and then you extract structure from that later. This winds up being surprisingly well-performing to the degree that, on average, the extracted models outperformed many of the experts.
And by extracted as in from multiple experts.
Actually, I'm not sure. I'd have to double-check that.
That would be a very interesting result if my model turned out to be better than me.
Well, they discuss this, and the reason that they give is that experts, especially high-status experts, it seems like they're tempted to make lots of exceptions, local exceptions to different rules. And on average, these exceptions make the results worse. And the idea is that, yeah, in theory, some adjustments are good and necessary probably, but there's probably some sort of excess tendency towards making exceptions, maybe to demonstrate cleverness or demonstrate that the expertise is...
or non-replaceability or something.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
I mean, even if they are not insecure, it might still just be, So this ethno-methodological approach is more effective than the just direct querying approach.
Yeah.
And this is relevant because...
it's relevant because learning directly from the expert, being in close quarters, is going to be very different from just hearing them lecture. Hearing them lecture is more likely to be some of their explicit knowledge, and being in close working relationship means you get the opportunity to watch them solve problems and query sort of what they're doing directly. Okay. And probably picking up on some mental moves and heuristics as you go.
Right. And saliences is another thing that you pick up on.
Yeah, how they structure their attention.
Yep. Yeah. Which is extremely difficult to convey in anything except the
Yeah, even us being able to have a conversation about it is, we have access to a relatively sophisticated philosophical sort of model of all of this that in most fields isn't necessarily developed super well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
even though in some abstract sense it is a vital matter for the academy of any civilization, this question of how do we structure our knowledge, do we even have a concept of our understanding of the world, one might say.
Right. Yeah. If you're going to treat, universities and knowledge transfer as non-magical,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we can make the case that the West still is treating this as a semi-magical process.
Mm-hmm.
Being at the frontier means being aware of all the decisions, not all, not completely and not all, but being somewhat aware of the decisions that have been made in the course of that field's development.
Right.
And oftentimes doing cutting edge work is making a choice slightly differently. Mm-hmm. So and that might be at a different cut point in time. So it might be that, okay, here's where we've reached, and as of last year, these people are over here working on this part, and I'm going to go in another direction and work on this other piece. Mm-hmm. But it might be also like 10 years ago, some choice was made and the field went in this direction. But actually that choice had like 3 degrees of freedom. And so there's like a significant space over here too. And maybe I'm going to go back to that and investigate what was going on there. And this is often how the formation of nascent fields works, right? Is, there's stagnation and then someone goes back and realizes, wait, no, that's pretty interesting. Oftentimes because some bottleneck that existed at the time has since shifted.
Computation is such
it's very dramatic.
Juicy, dramatic
Yeah.
example, yeah. You see these entire fields rise and fall within a single decade of chips being relatively faster or slower or something.
Right.
So, okay. And what about things that are more structural in nature? So, all of physics up till Einstein, for example, assumed that the underlying geometry of space in which they were operating was one way. And this was not a choice that was a choice point at just one piece. It was a choice point that in some sense was a structural choice made by the entire field for basically ever.
And that can be a bit more like seeing the water, right?
Yeah. So, but it still did not establish a new field. So, this is just something to think about. I mean, not.
No, it doesn't guarantee that you're starting a new field. I'm just saying this is often a piece of, if you look at the history of new fields, one of them is someone was studying something else,
Mm-hmm.
and then they chose an interesting branch point and started going off in a different direction.
Right. Here I'm saying the branch point lay far before the founding of the field itself. And that's an interesting question. Like, it doesn't seem to matter how far back in time the choice point was. But there seems to be a typology where certain types of decisions induce a new field, certain other types don't. It's probably hard to tell a priori which ones are which. If what we were discussing was in fact a well-developed academic discipline, this would probably be a well-studied problem. Like, turns out that these kinds of assumptions are actually core, these kinds are kind of...
foundational. I would say that it's something like, you definitely want to be on the lookout for foundational assumptions that are wrong. That's, that's where you get big, new, important results.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to get people to take you seriously or to get funding to do foundational work often.
Einstein didn't have any. It's just,
Yeah. Private or public, right?
Right.
I've observed just in my short, career, just like watching academia, I've observed organizations start up with the explicit intention of doing foundational work and then pivot to something easier. It's like, we have these established results, we can piggyback off of that. Something.
And why do you think that happens? Like I'm not asking just for a
bike
theoretical
shedding
model.
There's always a strong incentive to when you're boggling at foundations, it can look for long periods of time like nothing is happening.
Mm-hmm.
No one's having the eureka moment, and so there's not a feedback loop. And
oh, I see. So many of the ones that start out explicitly trying to do foundational work, in some sense, have not done the work to establish their own self-confidence in sitting in what appears to be sitting on their ass for 5 years.
Or justifying it to donors and such.
Right. Because I think even if in the initial burst of excitement, a donor might say, yes, something might take 10 years. After 15 annual meetings, after 15 meetings over 5 years where they've been repeatedly told, yes, we are in the sitting on our ass phase of things. It might be difficult to continue with that excitement.
Yeah, and because most people probably can't do the work, there's a strong moral hazard here where it becomes in people's interest to say, well, we're not going to have results for a long time. This makes it difficult for donors to measure, and so, charlatans can move in and just sort of sit on their ass.
Right, doing nothing as opposed to boggling.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Does that cover test taking, I think, pretty comprehensively?
I think we covered all 4 of them already.
Yeah. Oh, not just test, sorry. Teaching others. Does this cover teaching others quite comprehensively?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Lastly, the tutorial method as a proxy for direct inclusion, tacit transmission of all that stuff. Do you have any experience with anything at all of that kind? Formally or informally? Because obviously formally only Oxford and Cambridge and a few other places do it.
Very little direct engagement and discussion with foundational works, which is the valuable piece. I found that the attempts at doing such, a similar problem, would... there's this thing where online comments, where there's a news story and you're kind of curious about what people's commentary on it is, but then the top comment is something that's sort of tangential, and then most of the discussion thread is just people arguing about this tangential point that doesn't have anything to do with what you were originally interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Book clubs and research groups tend to be like this, right? Everyone has their own salience function of what's most interesting about the thing. And, if you're trying to really get at the philosophy, and in the discussion of Kant's, paper, it gets caught up in, the politics of the court that he was appeasing. It's like, yes, that's interesting, and there's definitely implications.
Mm-hmm.
But it might not be, if you're really deep in the sort of logical structure of the philosophical argument, you're just like, this is a total side quest.
Right.
Yeah. So I found that kind of thing happened a lot.
Okay. Do you think it could be a flinch response?
More bike shedding.
Flinch response because the foundations are in fact
hard,
and when you gaze into the abyss gazes into you.
Yeah.
And that's kind of uncomfortable. Okay.
The most valuable thing is to find people that you can have conversations with that include long silences.
Okay. So the tutorial is somewhat more mentorial than, at least definitely it starts out more mentorial than peer discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, of course, the idea is that you're still not a peer because that person has, spent way more time and effort doing the thing. But you're in some sense, qualitatively, if not quantitatively, one hopes, similar to them.
Well, I think that's partially to antidote what I was just talking about. The mentor is able to keep the conversation on track towards the aspects of it that are actually most important.
Mm-hmm. It's not research oriented, except incidentally, in that if somebody wildly exceeds the specifications of the question given to them, they might actually just generate a new insight. So there's always the possibility of actually doing some real innovative work in a tutorial if you're just that good, let's say.
So to get semi-technical, one of the things that you notice when you're trying to do that sort of guiding is if a person's representation that they're using to generate whatever they're doing has a lot of degrees of freedom, then fundamentally the conversation can become very unwieldy and wide-ranging,
mm-hmm.
Because everyone's doing all sorts of mapping to. There aren't a lot of constraints mm-hmm. on how everyone's mapping. Different people are mapping it in different ways, and this is not super well formed. Without an explanation of degrees of freedom, I'm not sure it would make sense to people.
The branch factor can be too high, and so everyone's salience functions can just totally diverge in some sense from the central point.
Yeah, and the branch factor can be high because there's nothing to say whether or not to choose between two branches. There aren't enough constraints.
Okay. And so the Oxford tutor would provide these constraints implicitly by means of...
he'd cut off. When you notice this is happening, you cut it off. and you redirect people's attention.
Okay. All right. Whereas in other cases, that's very difficult. If it's a pure peer group staring at a hard problem, none of them have any traction on.
Yeah.
All right.
I haven't, checked this super deeply, but my impression is that one of the better high-order compressions for explanation in general is that a good explanation has fewer degrees of freedom than the original representation.
Epicycles versus...
Yeah, the opposite of epicycles.
Ellipses.
Yeah.
It is an ellipse, right? Orbits?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And so you've never had formal tutorial style or even informal tutorial style experiences, but you've had peer experiences of the same thing, and those have the characteristics you described.
Yeah, I don't think I've had too many that were moderated by someone competent.
Okay. All right, I think that covers the section regarding your experience, and the second to last bit is how would and this is probably the most operationalizable bit for most people, is okay, how would you actually implement these things? Like, let us say I am Joe Random Learner. I have tolerated the discussion of abstract philosophy and methods so far. And I'm like, dude, when are you going to tell me what to do? Okay, great. So what do you have to say to Joe Random Learner? I ask, holding out my pen like some kind of a sleazy reporter with a microphone.
I mean, deliberate practice is going to expose a lot of cruft.
How can Joe Random Learner figure out how to do deliberate practice? Can you point him to something?
I don't recall off the top of my head which is the sort of canonical book on this.
But one could put in the podcast link or whatever below the description. Can we do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's it for deliberate practice. One can trust that you will give a source. Wonderful. How would that person then operationalize elaboration of context?
I think developing a second brain. Right? Having a really good note-taking system.
Okay.
So that you critically engage with the material. I mean, if you get sufficiently deep on the deliberate practice stack, you should notice that this is somewhat necessary, right? You need to start actually explicitly trying to chunk, not just intuitively feeling your way forward, but actually trying to write things down and say, okay, what do I think the subskills are? What are the errors for each subskill, and how can I practice each one of them? Right? You're not going to keep track of all that in your head. At least if you try to, you're going to underperform the person who explicitly tracks all of them and devotes their practice time in proportion to how big of each of the errors are contributing to total performance.
Okay. And you'll end up with some kind of a tracking system if you do deliberate practice. Mm-hmm. In addition, if you want to do elaboration of context, then...
Yeah, I mean, so you, in the course of doing that, you're also going to be looking up what other people's answers are, right? And so you're recording information from the domain, and so that's an opportunity to both take notes on other people's stuff, but remember what I mentioned, the calibration points. You can record your guesses, and then whatever info you end up finding out, and then your speculation about, what would it look like to, what's it called, dovetail, not dovetail, but calibrate, yeah,
triangulate.
To analyze the diff between your guess and the actual data.
What can you extract from the diff?
Yeah. There's directionality, magnitude.
Right. What's the vector of improvement for me at the moment?
Yep.
Okay. In addition, you think a legitimately good quality note-taking system would make the second component far easier to explicitly do?
Yeah, I mean, you're just not going to do this inside your head. It's not. It's not practical.
Yeah. So how does this look like in practice? When you're learning a topic,
For me, it's just outlining, right? It's just bulleted lists, and I'm just going through and creating sublists of various things.
And you allow the boundaries in this case to be nebulous.
Yeah.
As in, if there are related ideas that come to you, you don't say, "Oh, this was not in the book," or "This is not exactly the thing." You just put in there, and maybe.
Yeah, I throw it in, and what's going to happen is that in the course of that, I'm going to recrystallize a new model several times. And so I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to go back and try to like delete my old model. I'm just going to go ahead and clean sheet again. And like, okay, this time I had like these 4 moving components. Now I think it's 3 and they're different. And I'm just going to go ahead and write that down, right? And then I'm doing the process again. So I'm going through an iterative process multiple times.
Interesting. So do you think that this was, and this is just pure speculation, this probably is, we can use this calibration data at some point, but do you think that this was how some of the reformulations of things like mechanics came about, where people realized that there are multiple factors that you can divvy things up into, Hamiltonian and Lagrangian mechanics?
Yeah, I mean, everyone, all these geniuses have to sort of they have to do the translation work to turn everything that's been done into representations inside of their head that actually operate with their mathematical intuitions, right? Okay. And in the process of doing that, if they're genuinely engaging with it, then they might come up with their own representations, and some of them will be more efficient than what they're... So sometimes you come up with a representation, and you're like, this seems more efficient than what I'm looking at on the page.
Right.
Right? And then, of course, maybe you're mistaken. There's an excellent chance that you're mistaken, right? Some expert would be able to tell you, oh, no, but that doesn't take into account this and this, and, you tune. But eventually, if you reach the cutting edge, Feynman comes up with the diagrams and stuff. Your representation really is just like, no, this is a good carving, and there you go.
Right, the same way that the formalisms are neater in certain important ways than doing it the old way. So,
right.
Yeah. All right. Okay. That covers how to... Oh, by the way, do you do compression cycles also on your notes?
Yeah.
Okay, and do you do this explicitly or just when you feel a new model coming along and you're like, all right, time for a compression?
A little bit of both. So there's some intuitive, and then there's also some going back and trying to see if I missed anything.
Okay. All right. Does this significantly add to the amount of time that it takes you to learn things, or
no?
Is the efficiency gain...
So the efficiency gain. So at first it's slower, and that's why I think that's why this isn't already widespread. At first, it's going to seem like you're putting in a lot of extra effort, but as the meta process smooths out, the amount of time you save in learning new stuff. So like the performance metrics have been. I haven't obsessively tracked them, which is against the thing that I'm saying. I track inputs more than outputs. But anyway, the climb on the scale for measurable skills, like chess and Tetris and things like that, has always been very dramatic, right? So like going from the, 50th, 60th percentile of Tetris performance, because I literally never optimized it, to within 2 weeks going to, I think, like the 98th percentile of Tetris performance.
Okay.
In terms of like the world record leaderboards. It's like, yeah, I think this kind of, there's additional studies on pedagogy showing this effect consistently.
Okay, and this is on the leaderboards to begin with.
What do you mean?
This is on the Tetris leaderboards to begin with.
To begin with.
As in you're all the 90th percentile among people who are
who are actually trying. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry I interrupted. You were saying?
That you see that 2 standard deviation effect with just one-on-one tutoring.
The Bloom's 2 sigma.
Yeah. And I think
didn't mention that, but that was also part of the 5th point of Oxford tutorial and whatnot. Yeah.
Right. And so I assume that tutors are doing some of these, and they're probably doing some of them significantly better than you get in a one-to-many lecture style format.
Right.
Because the feedback loop is a lot tighter.
Right, and also unifocal.
Yeah.
Okay. That's an interesting question. Like, how broad, what's the trade-off between, how many focal points the feedback loop has that the tutor has versus how many sigma they get? Because if you can get 1.95 even with three people, it's like, yeah, it's a reasonable trade-off, unless, you're nobility or something. Okay. Yeah, and now we come to probably, I think this covers elaboration of context pretty well, right? Like nebulous boundaries, allowing things to compress, and then again, the new model will probably invite more things into it as it illuminates more, and this continues until, right, cool. Alright, test taking, and this is probably one of the more difficult ones. Like, how do you create an effective forcing function for yourself with test taking?
I haven't really found a way. The best that's widely available is just the problem sets from textbooks.
Okay.
Because there you have problems and answers that have been curated. So yes, the thing that everyone skips.
Wait. Why? What do you mean everyone skips?
The joke is that people read textbooks, but they don't.
Oh,
do the
okay.
problems.
No, I can vouch for the efficacy of this method. I remember one time when a day before a particular test, I sat down and, partially as a preparatory, and after a while it became a bit of an ego gratification exercise where I was like, how much of this this was in computation complexity theory, not the same class, a different one, introductory, foundational one rather. It was like, how much of this can I do without putting pen to paper? Where a pen to paper it's not you lose points, it's just, all right, you use it only if you're forced to.
Mm-hmm.
And that one evening session was actually just significantly productive because I burned through 15, 20 problems.
Mm-hmm.
And these were not trivial problems, they were proofs. And okay, the beginning ones were easy, but the later ones actually required a click of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just going to town on those was, it was a non-trivial skill upgrade. And this was just a single evening. So yeah, it makes me regret my misspent youth in a sense. It's like, wow, if I had done that every evening, then I'd probably be...
Well, that's not sustainable.
It was a chunk of maybe 2.5 hours of effort.
It's not the way that efforting like that works. So there's fatigue that sets in with real cognitive restructuring. There's a certain sort of concentrated and then diffuse, and the diffuse tends to last for some period of time, but you can't just do it all the time.
Oh, no, not all the time. I'm saying, but if I had put in even 3 hours a day, which is about how much?
Well, maybe once a week.
That's it?
So like sessions that significantly transform your understanding. So this is spaced repetition, which is like probably the most interesting result that's not in this thing that we've discussed, because it has shown some interesting effects in literature, and I don't know what to say about it. Anyway, so like it just... Like, you're underestimating what doing that once a week would be like for real, right? It's instead setting up this, like, I don't know, crazy cultivation scheme that's, like, unrealistic. But the once a week version is already unrealistic enough in terms of normal people's performance. I would think that the strongest reinforcement would be to work through it with another person who's actually very dedicated to getting through this material.
Okay.
So, and not multiple people, because then each person has bystander effect.
Yep.
Right? So it's one other person, and if you don't show up, then the session was skipped. So it's like there's a strong commitment.
Okay.
And there might also have to be some working through of ego. If one person's catching on to the material a little bit faster, that might cause some friction. But, if you're both mature, the point is that at the end you want to both have the material done.
Mm-hmm.
So I would guess that would be bigger than trying to set up your own structures that then you're in charge of enforcing. It always winds up being kind of a shit show for most people.
Yeah, no, I can completely agree with that. Okay, so if you don't have a test, another person can be a useful goad, or you can be mutual goads to each other. Alright. And you said that progressive summarization often is a component of test taking? Or it subsumes a bunch of... Test taking subsumes a bunch of... or forces a bunch of study skills?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Alright. And how does one operationalize teaching others? Some people I know write blog posts as if they were teaching others.
Yeah. I think just choosing to participate in local groups that are looking for speakers, writing blog posts, creating tutorial videos, all of these are fantastic. Okay.
Do you think transparency is useful here, saying that, hey, this is just me learning the thing, and so if it's useful, great, but if it's not, there's no,
you don't want to necessarily set yourself up as an authority in a way that's,
you just make it clear, this is part of my own process, and if it helps anyone else, that's wonderful. I will pretend it is so that I'll act as if I were actually getting the teaching others benefit, but yeah, okay. And lastly, and this is probably the most difficult of all of them to operationalize, how does one get into a mentorial relationship with someone?
I mean, the biggest way is just asking. Most people don't ask. I've known people that had excellent results getting mentors just by requesting. There's a lot of people out there that if someone requests them to mentor them, it's just like feels nice that someone wants to learn from your experience.
Okay. How does this play out in fields where the person is already time strapped? Like, should you, because aiming for professor seems like a more difficult thing here. unless you already have some link. Maybe showing up at where universities have open seminars or there's a group that meets. Showing up for
You can
classes.
also just audit courses often. A lot of universities allow that.
So they allow you to go in, sit in on the class, but you don't get anything formally, and you should ideally not take up the prof's time also.
Yes.
From the people who have paid for it. Okay. I know that there used to be research groups or other things that used to meet. This is if you're at the at the actual pointy end of things, where so and so department has a meeting in so and so room, and if it's an open campus kind of university, you can just walk in and listen to so and so speaker speak.
Yeah, I mean, also if you go and meet people in a department, you'll often find out about events that, there's no like strict, like this must only be, like it's just an event. And if they want to invite you because you happen to be interested in the field. So I've done that before.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Also, lastly, this is probably a historically contingent thing, but the fact that, late stage PhD students are paid a relative pittance compared to what they're actually doing, do you think there's an opportunity for someone who's outside academia to get access to good quality tutoring at maybe not, the level of a PhD, but...
No, at the level of PhD, you can, there's a lot
but
of
everything
people,
up to that point.
You can pay them, I don't actually know what the going rate is, but I've seen this number quoted before, $20, $25 an hour.
Okay, that sounds inordinately low. Okay, wow.
So,
depressingly
if a person is cash strapped, right, they're living on a stipend, and you offer to pay them a decent, hourly rate to do something that's related to what they're already doing, rather than them having to go get a job where they are in a completely different mental space, that's better for them. Right. It's less of a shift.
I would have, maybe the Bay Area has warped my thinking, because I was thinking 40 is probably...
In the Bay Area, it's probably higher. I
agree.
Yes. But a lot of places...
Oh, so if you're willing to move to a place like Ann Arbor, for instance, and, pay somebody there $30 an hour, that person, for him...
because a lot of stipends are like $30K a year, right?
Yeah. So. Yeah. So if you're willing to pay them for, let's say...
And especially if you make it not unpleasant, right?
3 hours, 3 hours
if
session
it's a few hours a week, and you're not coming in with a bunch of stupid questions and expecting them to hold your hand.
Oh, no. So there are some books that talk about how to structure tutorials, which you can use and probably tell that person, dude, can you do it?
Like, if you do this well, they're actually getting benefit out of it, because they're teaching.
Right.
Yeah. And this isn't the be-all, end-all, because pedagogy is not a super well-developed field. So there might be major discoveries, there almost certainly are major discoveries waiting to be made that would be improvements on this. This is...
So, first rough cut of what we know at the moment.
Yeah, what we think we know, right? Study quality, all sorts of things might be going on. But this is what we think we know. It comports with my understanding and experience.
And so, if you had to put this into a recommendation, these are things definitely worth trying out at least. Yeah. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and worth trying before you go chasing other wild geese.
Right. These are relatively robust. Okay. Well, thank you very much.